Welcome to our presentation, A Colourful Past, the digital recolouring of the sarcophagus of Mer-Neith-it-is. The authenticity of museum displays has been a hotly debated topic for many years. While digital visualisation methods are now commonly employed in a range of humanities contexts, it's increasingly recognised that there is a need to ensure that such work is intellectually and technically rigorous. Faced with this challenge, we were asked to digitally recolour a high-definition 3D scan of the faded timber sarcophagus of Mer-Neith-it-is and produce an educational animation for museum display at the new Chalchak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney. Authenticity for this recolouring required extensive collaboration with a multidisciplinary team of Egyptologists, scientists and museum curators. Inquiry into and experimentation with the technology required to discover the hidden story on the surface of the faded coffin and to remake and reapply the decorative markings resulted in the development of novel true digital practice methods. So who is Mer-Neith-it-is and how did we become involved? In 1860, Sir Charles Nicholson donated an Egyptian coffin to the University of Sydney that he purchased in Saqqara, Egypt. The coffin is carved in a style consistent with the 26th dynasty, and hieroglyph text painted on the side of the coffin name its occupant as the woman Mer-Neith-it-is, who worked in the temple of Sekhmet. Although once highly decorated, the painted motifs and texts have faded over time. In 2018, with the discovery of a partially preserved mummy inside, the Nicholson Museum senior curator Dr. James Fraser formed a cross-institutional team of researchers with the goal of revealing more about the occupant, Mer-Neith-it-is, and to digitally recolour a high-definition 3D scan to produce an educational animation for museum display. The broader research project involved examination of both the exterior and interior of the coffin, and the results, along with the digital recolouring of the coffin, form part of a large public display and education program on ancient Egyptian funerary practices at the Chalchak Wing Museum that opened at the University of Sydney in late 2020. In pushing the boundaries of scientific illustration into new domains, we explored through practice the question of whether it was possible to digitally replicate the hand-drawn aesthetic of the ancient Egyptian artists by combining traditional linework drawings with the latest digital technology. We used a mixed methods approach for this research, utilising traditional research methods such as historical research, comparative iconographical studies, and collaborative discussions, along with practice-based methods such as colour enhancement, digital rendering, storyboarding, and animation, using a range of software packages such as B.Drabsch, Substance Painter, Photoshop, Blender, and Premiere Pro. The process was iterative, with many creative problem-solving moments, technical challenges, and dead ends. The final animated outcome will tell two narratives. The first will focus on the research relating to the scanning and recolouring of the coffin itself, and the second will explore the iconographical elements of the coffin, illuminating Mer-Neith-it-is' name, the protective goddesses, sons of Horus, and Anubis. Our task of producing a recoloured 3D model and animation was undertaken with the assistance of archaeologists from the University of Sydney, Egyptologists and radiologists from Macquarie University, and a team of scientists from Sydney Analytical who helped to determine the original pigment colours through the use of reflectance spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy and PXRF analysis. And you can see here in this slide the team working to isolate different areas for us and to be able to understand the trace elements and what they meant in terms of pigments on the surface. Our role was to help see, discover and visually describe the decorative elements and narrative on the surface of the coffin. Our process involved three main phases. The first was observation and comparative analysis, where we used a range of methods to enhance the photogrammetry capture of the coffin, and to be able to see more clearly the marks on the surface, to conduct a contextual review of comparative examples, to identify the style and the finish that we were aiming for in terms of an aesthetic, scientific analysis of the surface to understand the pigment and the palette that we needed to use, and also to engage in collaborative discussions as we developed our understanding of the aesthetic that would form the final recolouring. The second stage was mapping the surface, where we produced a line drawing of the entire surface, all surfaces of the coffin. This was the basis for collaborative review and discussion, and then also formed the basis of a template to start the recolouring process. We then moved into studio-based inquiry and studio practice, where we experimented with recreating the hieroglyphs, looking at line treatment, colour palette, and application methods to simulate the original process and aesthetic. We also looked within the 3D space as well, looking at processes for rebuilding the model, generating new texture maps, reapplying texture maps, looking at lighting effects, and surface quality treatments for the final render. We also then looked at storyboarding as a way to construct the visual narrative to tell the story of the recolouring and research process, and also the story of the text described on the surface. This would ultimately inform the final animation. The hieroglyphs and decorative elements were identified using the colour enhancement plugin B.Drabsch. The texture maps were altered with a range of colour and contrast controls to enhance the images of partial and faded hieroglyphs. Sometimes the same section was processed several times to build a clearer picture of a decorated section. For example, here, the same section of the lid of the coffin was altered with a different colour and contrast parameters to build a more complete picture of the winged goddess Nut that appeared on the chest plate on the lid of the coffin. We worked meticulously along each decorated register of the coffin to describe what could be seen to the naked eye and what was revealed through the enhancement processes. Our drawings were checked with Egyptologists, and any remaining pigments of these areas were analysed and identified in an effort to build a clearer plan for the remaking and recolouring, and ultimately applying new decorative elements to the surface of the 3D model. You can see here on this slide we employed a catalogue system where we numbered each hieroglyph that we saw, we illustrated it, and then this became the basis for collaborative discussion, and then ultimately the final template to remake the hieroglyphs. In a pragmatic sense, we worked on both screen and from large life-size printouts to examine and draw the surface's decorative elements. You can see here in situ, standing in front of the coffin itself and observing and drawing what we can see, and then using the large-scale printouts to fill in the gaps or to complete things that we'd drawn from partial hieroglyphs. There were crucial areas of the coffin story that we focused on and developed working drawings to discuss with the broader group. One of these areas was on the back of the head of the coffin, and it depicted the mummy of Mer-Neith-it-is being greeted by Anubis. Depicted here with a jackal head, Anubis is seen to be wrapping bandages around the mummy of Mer-Neith-it-is. An important part of our research approach was sourcing comparative examples from the same time period to examine decorative styles and craftsmanship for this type of and quality of artefact. We considered a range of artefacts and looked at how the mark making was made and applied, focusing on examples with similar levels of finish quality. Coupled with the pigment analysis, we could start to experiment with developing an aesthetic for the recolouring process.
When it came to working with the digital files and the digital model, there was a number of issues that we ran into. And these were largely a result of, realistically, the density of the model that we received from the scanning company. Because it was of an archive grade, striving for the greatest amount of accuracy within the 3D model and how it related to the physical object. Because of this density, we were unable to process a lot of our changes and view what we were doing anywhere near real time, with multiple minutes being required to do anything. This was because we had around 325 triangles per cubic centimetre in space. With this model being over 180 centimetres tall, it was quite a significant amount of information within that file. In the end, the whole sarcophagus was around 24 million points in 3D space, fully assembled. In order to overcome this, we had to reduce it down to about 10% of this density while we were working on it, so we could get back a bit more of a real-time workflow. Also, because of this high level of detail, the model was delivered to us in 6 independent chunks, which, when you're trying to locate a hieroglyph in 3D space and the relationship that it has around its surrounding ones, it's quite difficult to do this when you have to change 3D files and track it across the two of them. So this was another one of the motivators for that smaller quality model, and prior to its creation, the 6 chunks were stuck together first before being reduced in quality. Once the problem had been solved with the actual 3D model being difficult to see individual elements, the next stage that we had to solve was the actual texture information. So this is the color information that's overlaid over the top of the 3D model. If you're ever familiar working with photogrammetry software, so software that creates a 3D model from a series of stills that you've taken with a camera, it will assemble the 3D model by tracking points as it moves across the image, but it'll also create the image texture from those photos. It'll stitch them together. However, what it generates is this image that you can see here. With 3D models, the color information relates to points on their surface, very similar to how you would have a pattern in sewing. So the UV map, which is the flattened image, or the texture, which is the flattened image, relates back to the UV map. And the UV map is kind of the flattened t-shirt somewhat, with the texture applied to the model is the final piece once you have sewn it all together. These came in as completely a computer-generated format, so we also had to recreate the pattern for how the information lies back onto the model so that we were able to go in and draw in a linear fashion the hieroglyphs and study them next to each other. So here in the top left corner represents, this is the image of what we had before and the progress as it goes to the usable state for the project. Once all those problems had been solved, it was only then that we were able to go through this concept development stage where we were experimenting with lighting and starting to develop the initial look and feel of the model, as well as test how is the animation going to fade between the different layers. How the final animation was constructed was the original as well as recolored sarcophagus were 2 separate models and files that were rendered with the same animation, and then they were faded across between the 2 renders in post.
Our approach to recolouring took into consideration many factors and was arrived at through studio experimentation with techniques and the applications of the findings of ours and the group's initial research. The graphic here breaks down the main considerations when developing the final aesthetic. How does the combination of materials together produce the final look? From the substrate, its texture, to the layers of materials from possible and potential surface primers to the level and type of gloss varnish used. Addressing the graphic elements in a layered form allowed scope to experiment with the opacity and interplay of the visual layers within graphic software to arrive at the final aesthetic. Here's an example of studio experimentation where a range of brushes were explored to replicate the line work. The palette was explored, and then the application of those new graphics to the timber surface itself. Using a range of 2D and 3D software, each decorative element was remade and then reapplied to the surface, using a process of blending and masking to integrate the new hieroglyphs into the natural textures and undulating surface forms of the timber structure. In this example, experimentation with scanned hand-drawn ink line work was overlaid on the original faded surface. This approach resulted in developing digital brushes that would simulate the 2D ink line work. It was always the intention in the recolouring of the 3D scan to only remake what could be discovered through the broader research and embrace the textural and organic form of the original artefact. Progressive weathering was explored in the rendering process with the use of layer masks and opacities, providing a means to arrive at this final aesthetic and to evidence the original materiality of the coffin itself. Our role was to recolour the 3D scan of the coffin and then to create the animation that would tell the story of the research, as well as the story of Mer-Neith-it-is. And here is the resulting animation.